Okay, we are recording. Hello and welcome everybody to today's panel discussion, Process Observers in University Counseling Center Groups. So this program is put on by AGPA, College Counseling and Other Educational Settings Special Interest Group. My name is Ksenia Zhuzha and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I will be serving as a moderator for today's panel. I'm a psychologist and a group coordinator at the University of Nevada, Reno Counseling Services. And I also serve as education chair of the College Counseling Special Interest Group of AGPA. So I'm connecting to you today from Reno, Nevada, which is the traditional territory of the Veach Nation. We are joined today by three panelists. Leslie Veach is a certified group psychotherapist, counselor and group coordinator at East Carolina University. You are not seeing her right now on the screen. She will join us in a little bit. She's taking care of some family stuff. Now we have Joeleen Cooper-Bhatia, who is a certified group psychotherapist, psychologist, associate director, and group coordinator at Auburn University in Alabama. And we have Jason Boothe with us today, who is a psychologist, group coordinator, associate director, and director of clinical services at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's an honor for me to have you on this program. Before we begin, I let our panelists take over. I would like to give a brief overview of Zoom and the format of this presentation. So automatic live captioning is enabled for this event. You can usually turn it on and off by selecting the closed captions icon on the navigation panel, which is usually at the bottom of your screen. Please note that your microphone will be muted by the host throughout the presentation as it is right now. This is just to eliminate background noise, which can be disruptive. If you're seeing myself and at the moment two panelists on the screen, you are in speaker view. It is the recommended setting for this webinar. However, you have the option to switch to gallery view, which will allow you to see more participants on one screen. You can switch between views at your discretion by clicking speaker view or gallery view, which is likely located in the upper right corner of your Zoom screen. This webinar is being recorded. Once it is uploaded to YouTube, all of you will receive an email with a link to the recording. So sometimes it takes a little bit to get the recording uploaded because we ask AGPA to upload it to their YouTube page. And so sometimes it can take 1 to 4 weeks depending on AGPA's availability. So please be patient if it's taking a little bit. So a few words about how today's program is structured. For the first hour, panelists will discuss process observer models they use in their groups and counseling centers and answer questions I've prepared for them. And then the last 30 minutes of the event will be devoted to questions from the audience. So please hold your questions until the Q&A portion, which is the last 30 minutes. During that time, you can simply unmute your microphone and ask your question. For accessibility reasons, if you are not able to ask your question verbally during the Q&A portion, you can write it into the chat. So, all right, with that, I will turn it over to Joeleen to begin our discussion panel and tell us about the group program at Auburn University and how she incorporates process observers into therapy and training. Joeleen, please get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Ksenia, and thank you everyone for being here today. As Ksenia mentioned, I'm Joeleen, and I'm the Associate Director and Group Coordinator at Auburn University Student Counseling and Psychological Services. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Auburn, Alabama, which is native land of the Muskogee Nation. And Auburn University has approximately 30,000 students. A little bit about our group program, just to give some context. For the spring 2022 semester, we had 25 groups running. 11 were process-oriented groups. That includes more general groups specific to graduate students also. We also have 12 additional therapy groups that were more focused on specific concerns or populations, like our Black Experience group, empowerment group, facing family friction. And we also had 2 drop-in groups where students could drop in as needed. So in terms of how we use process observers, this is something we've been doing for several years as student counseling. Any ongoing therapy group can have a process observer if it's appropriate, and I coordinate that as the group coordinator. In general, we don't have process observers for groups that are new to the center, like things we're just figuring out or trying to do for the first time, or situations where it could create a dual relationship. So for example, one of our Auburn practicum students observing a graduate student USO group where there may be some people who are in the mental health field. The number of process observers we have really varies per semester. In the spring, we had 2 process observers that stayed with their group for the entire semester. Most frequently, our practicum students are our process observers. Those are students in the Ph.D. programs in clinical and counseling psychology, or MSW programs here at Auburn. And we use it primarily as a training tool. So to co-facilitate groups, practicum students need to have had a graduate practicum class. But if they haven't had that, one way they could fulfill that requirement is through doing some process observation along with some readings. We've also had students elect to process observe groups if they don't feel ready to jump in and co-lead a group. They want to get some more experience, more of a feel for how we do things. And we also do occasionally have new staff members come and process observe group for a session or 2 if they want to get a sense of how groups are run at our agency and they're interested in doing that. So for us, process observers really are open to any appropriate group. That could be groups led by a senior staff member, could be led by 2 senior staff members, and could be led by a staff member and a trainee. For us, just something interesting to note is that our process observers are generally outside the circle, but what that looks like depends on what office they're in. So one of our offices has an observation room, and that's where the process observers stay until their time to come in, which I'll explain in a minute. In our other location, they sit outside the circle, but in the room. And at the end, we do ask our process observers to come in for a brief post-processing period where they share feedback with the members. Members are informed that they're welcome to stay and hear this feedback, but we do ask that they not verbally participate in it so that we don't take too much time of theirs. We do ask them and let them know that their feedback is valuable and just bring that up in the next group session. And all of our groups that are led with trainees include a 30-minute supervision session. Process observers are generally involved in this in different ways, depending on the senior staff member who's leading the group. That could be them being involved in the entire 30-minute supervision session. It could mean for a portion and another portion where the co-leaders of the group meet just individual or just between the 2 of them. So that's an overview from my end.
Thank you so much, Joeleen. Jason, how about you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Boothe. I am the Associate Director and Clinical Director, Group Therapy Coordinator for University of Houston Clear Lake Counseling Services. Our university is located on the native lands of the Karankawa and the Ekokisa people. Our university is considerably smaller than Joeleen's. We're between 9,000 and 10,000 students. That fluctuates. We're currently at about 9,500. So our group offerings are considerably smaller. We historically run and have run about 5 groups this last semester. That sometimes fluctuates, but usually it's about 5. We have a mix of process groups and sort of psychoed support groups. Most recently, we have offered process groups for understanding self and other, a relational trauma process group, a grief process group, an expressive arts process group. And then we also, we do a couple of ACT groups for anxiety and depression. We do a couple of sort of loosely DBT-based skills module groups that run about 4 to 6 sessions. And then we have a few support groups for LGBT or other issues that students are facing. We have process observers for all of our process-oriented groups. We don't have them for generally for the support groups and those sorts of things. We did recently, we tried to have one for the ACT group, and that went well enough. So we have a training program that has 6 trainees. 3 of them are part of our APA approved doctoral program, and 3 of them are practicum students. And that number stays the same year to year. So we always have 6 trainees. And that allows for our process groups, all of our process groups, hopefully, to have process observers. We try to incorporate prac students as process observers. We've done it historically for many years. And we have a developmental model approach to that. So our groups are typically run by an intern and a senior staff member co-leading, with the practicum student serving as process observer. Using the developmental model, assuming everyone progresses the way they should, we will generally switch out positions. So over the course of a semester, for the first third of the semester, the prac student will be the process observer. The second half, the intern will be process observer. And then the third half, the senior staff member acts as process observer and actually watches the intern and prac student lead the group. Similar to what was just said, we tend to have our process observers outside of the group circle. They're invited in the last 10 to 15 minutes to give their observations. We do invite the group members to give feedback in real time, and we encourage a dialogue around that. And that comes with pluses and minuses, but that is the way we choose to do it. And then after the group is over, we do have our supervision. So if our process groups usually run an hour and 15 minutes, we do that last 30 to 45 minutes of that set block of time for group supervision with the prac student and the intern for the entirety of the time. So our prac students will stay in that supervision as part of what we do.
Jason, and for the AGT group that you mentioned, did that look different?
It looked a little different insofar as the process student, let me back up. This is my understanding. I didn't lead the ACT group, but the process was really similar, except in the end, when the process observer was invited into the group, the observations were less process oriented and more just kind of observations around members' reactions to the assignment pieces or the meditation pieces or those sorts of things. So there was still feedback offered, but it wasn't as maybe relational or process oriented as you would find in a more stereotypical kind of understanding self and other group.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Leslie, how are you doing? Are you ready to jump in?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Playing multiple roles today, mom and group coordinator. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Leslie Veach. My pronouns are she, her, hers. So I'm the group coordinator and a staff counselor as well at East Carolina University. I've been here since July 2014, so coming up on 8 years. A little bit about ECU. We are a state-funded institution, university, and we're in Greenville, North Carolina. And we do acknowledge the Tuscarora people for their traditional custodianship of the land in which we live and work. Here at the Counseling Center, we're part of it's the Center for Counseling and Student Development. We have roughly 16 clinical staff members. We do have 2 current vacancies right now. So when we're full staff, it looks more like about 18. So as far as the groups that we offer, I know in thinking about this, I kind of broke it down pre-pandemic to kind of current day, because it does look quite a bit different than what it was looking like before. So we had just about every clinical staff member was involved in a group of some kind before a couple years before the pandemic. So we were leading about 7 to 8 groups per semester. And then we'd also have 2 skills groups that were 3-week run skills seminars. So 3 modules in each each one, but those would be run on a rotating basis. So I guess to give it some context for our process observers, of those 7 to 10 groups, we typically had 3 that were understanding self and others, or the interpersonal process groups. And then others were more client or issue specific, kind of similar to what was shared already. So right now, this year, we've had 2 interpersonal process groups, and we have one identified as a general process group, the other as LGBTQ identified clients. So we have 2 running now, and then we've had 2 sections of a sexual assault response or support group, which is kind of psychoed support and a little process in there as well, that have run 2 sections of those actually each semester. So that's been ongoing throughout the pandemic. And then we've had a grief drop-in group that has continued as well. So that's kind of what we have now. I hope we'll be back to looking more like we were pre-pandemic. Our process observers really, I think similar to what I was hearing Joeleen say, you can really participate in any group. The trend has been more the understanding self and others group. Our trainees are typically from 2 programs. They're graduate students, so they're still enrolled in their programs, and they are either from the health psych Ph.D. program at our institution, or they're from either a master's or PhD level counseling program. And so their introduction to group sometimes is at our center. Others may already have experience as a clinician and are coming back to school. So it kind of varies. So we're really tailor it to the experience that they are wanting or needing based on kind of where they are in their career. So most recently, we've had our health psych students are actually graduate assistants as well, and they stay with us the whole academic year. And so they begin in the fall as a process observer for one of our groups, typically interpersonal process, and then they transition into a co-leadership role for the spring. So that's been the model we've been using so far. I think I've covered most of our topics. Did I miss something?
And for the supervision, the debrief.
Okay. Yes. So what we will have the process observers start with as early as pre-screening. So they're part of the pre-screening process, and we are typically, if they're with me, then, which several of them have been, then I'm providing them directly kind of one-on-one. So an intro to what their role will look like. They, if they're with another group of clinicians, then I may spend a little bit of time with them, but it's really up to the leaders of that group to introduce them to what their role will be like in the group. So if it's a skills group, for instance, will they help be only process observing, or will they also be taking on some speaking roles? And then they do participate in post reflection after group is over, which is not with the clients, so just with the 2 co-leaders. And so they get quite a bit of time with us as leaders, co-leaders throughout the fall semester. And many times we'll have them transition into a speaking role, maybe the last third of the semester, and that might start with just sharing their impressions with the group of what they're noticing, and then kind of gradually coming into more of a speaking role. And so I'm not the direct supervisor oftentimes for those students. They're also supervised by our director of training or our assistant director, and so they'll be meeting one-on-one, and so with them as well. So we collaborate with that supervision.
Oh my gosh, I had a clarification question for you, Leslie. Maybe it'll come back to me. Oh, your process observers, are they in the room? You may have mentioned that.
Sorry, I'm not sure that I did. Yes, they are in the room. We're still virtual with our groups right now, so they are in the virtual room with us. And but yes, when we are in the center, they're sitting in the room in the circle. They're part of the circle. I know sometimes people have them sit outside, but they're in the circle together. And I'm trying to think. Someone mentioned about professional staff or clinical full-time clinical staff will sometimes serve as process observers if they're newer to group or trying to get a feel. So we do that as well. And though they're not necessarily there the whole semester if they're going to process observe, but where that's been used mostly has been in the summer groups. We'll have we have a little bit more, time freed up for clinical time that you can do that. So that's been I think a real bonus for newer staff coming in saying, I've led a lot of groups like this, but not any like this. And so if they are able to sit in maybe for the full 8 weeks or however long that summer group runs, but they are also in the group sitting in the circle.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we will jump into the questions I've prepared for the panelists. So my first one is, what are your reasons for having process observers and what benefits do you see? Joeleen, you've already kind of started talking about training purpose. So maybe if you have anything to add, we'll start with you and then go to Jason and Leslie.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the huge benefits is it is part of the training process for us. It helps students who are in programs that don't have a group therapy course that they've taken to get the opportunity to potentially co-lead a group. So it helps them kind of build up their skill level, understand group a bit more. I think it's actually really beneficial to the group members as well. We've had lots of positive feedback from the group members on hearing a different perspective, on being able to get that feedback immediately at the end of the group. And I also find it incredibly beneficial to have another set of eyes on the group. A lot of times the process observers pick up on things that honestly I didn't notice, or just maybe wasn't as attentive to. So I think there have been a lot of benefits that I've had from it.
How about you, Jason?
Yeah, so a lot of my reasons are similar. We, even before I got here in 2012, this department had a reputation for, they didn't have full-on process observers, but they always had a reputation for having a strong training program, even before they had a formal internship. They had, they would bring in practicum students, or they would allow doctoral people, doctoral level trainees to do informal internships before there was a formal APA approved internship program here. And so the program comes with a long history of really believing in group training. And so once the APA program or the APA approved internship was designed, group training became a required element. And so it's been around from the very beginning for all of the same reasons that have already been mentioned. The other thing that I think we noticed was that for practicum students, at least based on our experience, maybe anecdotally, but also backed up by some data, prac students don't often get group therapy training as part of their training. And so we felt like we were in a pretty unique opportunity to be able to provide that. So in addition to all of the other things that have been said, it also makes prac students more competitive for internship when they get there, because it's just an additional point of training that intern candidates don't often have a lot of before they get there. So that's the one thing I would add.
Thank you.
I think it also is a chance for our graduate assistants and our other trainees a chance to work with other CCSD staff other than their direct supervisor. And because our schedules get so busy, we're often, we say, our doors are open and come by and chat with us, but it's hard to do when you're having to close your doors because of you're in session or you're in supervision and that kind of thing. So I think particularly since we've been working virtually, and it has given us a chance to have more contact with other members of the staff. And I think having two co-leaders and a process observer also helps to model the group process and among the co-facilitators, and that process. So we'll do a lot of here and now of like what's showing up for us and what are we noticing in our little small group. So I think that's helpful too. But yeah, as a staff member, as a clinician, having the process observer their eyes and ears, they're seeing things from a new or fresh perspective. that is, I think, is really helpful. The other part is not always, but most of the time they're closer to the age of the clients I'm working with than I am. I'm closer to, the mothers of the clients in age or maybe older. So that's another perspective for me, is like having clinicians or training clinicians in training in their 20s, for instance, kind of listening and hearing things. And so that's been almost comical at times, because there may be things that kind of go over my head and they're like, oh no, this is what they were talking about. So that's kind of a side note as well.
So the themes I'm hearing is more contact with different staff members and trainees, kind of integration of trainees that you normally, or even other staff members normally not see, like in your kind of daily work life, so to speak. I'm hearing that it's an additional training opportunity for people who have not had much introduction to process groups. And I also hear that there's kind of extra set of eyes on the therapeutic process, which is often helpful. I have a small follow-up questions to this. So in terms of the training benefit, what do you think about having a process observer versus putting somebody who is very green straight into the co-leader role? How come you think that process observer is a beneficial first step?
I guess I'll jump in and speak to that. What I have heard back from the process observers themselves is that they were freed up to really observe and absorb the process and understand that on a deeper level, because there wasn't the pressure to speak or to provide an intervention. And so I think that's, for a process-oriented group, that's the number one benefit. And even in some of our groups that may be a little bit more skills or support related, like a graduate student support group, for instance, and still this process is still happening, right? And so that being freed up to see that. And so I don't think it has to be done that way, but that is a benefit. And that in the end, I can only recall really one trainee that was ever resistant to the idea of process observing. And I think maybe it wasn't presented to them with the benefits of what they were going to gain. It was more as if we didn't think they were ready to co-lead, and that wasn't really the case. So I think that has kept me tuned into really describing it more about what they're going to gain and kind of the opportunity. I wish I could process observe more.
I think for us, it's a couple of things. One is most basic level, it's a little bit of a way to control kind of what's being said. So the fact that the process observer only speaks for, say, 10 minutes or so, if we're unsure of their level or how they're going to do it, is one small way to gauge. But I also think, truthfully, lots of prac students or people who are really green, who've never done group, it's a pretty anxiety-provoking experience. And being in the process observer role, though anxiety-provoking, really does, some ways, in kind of what Leslie said, frees them up to not have to worry about being the one who provides an intervention or really has to track in the same way. And so I do think that there is, there's a lot of good reason to necessarily have someone in the process observer role first, sort of for that reason. There was another point that I was going to add, and it has slipped my mind. So if I think of it, I'll say it in a second. But I do think that on a certain level, and this goes for all of our training, regardless of the modality or what we're training. I don't know that we'd go so far as we have the traditional medical model of like see one, do one, teach one, but it's that philosophy of we sort of expect them to watch first before you're allowed to interact in any real meaningful way, so that you get a sense of kind of the culture and what happens and those sorts of things. And so in some ways, that's the spirit of what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm hearing that maybe if a trainee or person who's new to group, may not even be trainee, observe first, when they transition into that speaking role, they're not as flooded by anxiety because they already have some comfort. They've already seen what happens.
That's the hope anyway. Doesn't always go down that way, but yes, that is the hope for what happens.
Okay. All right, awesome. Next question. Leslie, you already started speaking to this a little bit. What training or preparation do you have for your process observers? Leslie, maybe you can start, and you already start talking about that you do a little bit of one-on-one prep. I'm curious if there's any like workshops that you put together, if there's like multiple process observers that you have. Tell us a little bit more about what you do with that.
Okay, yeah, sure. So we have a trainee seminar that is, it's on Friday mornings, and we have a rotating schedule of who's presenting at that seminar. So I typically have one of the earlier slots so I can introduce group in general. And a part of that is I do try to introduce what their opportunities are going to look like regarding group for the semester or for the school year. And if they've already been assigned to a particular group, then kind of making sure they understand sort of the array of groups that we offer, and so how they might use their process observing role as an opportunity to get the introduction. But as far as their role, I do provide them with a number of handouts, reading materials, a lot of which has come from our SIG, the College Counseling Center SIG. And a lot of it is focused on how to notice the group as a whole, how to recognize group process, and that those materials are available. So I kind of flood them with information, and they kind of narrow it down to here are the pieces that might be most helpful to really focus in on. They can go back to, there's a folder they can go back to and get more information. And then from there, I will have, as I said, some one-on-one time with the process observers, certainly with my groups, but a lot of times if their co-leaders are new to having a process observer themselves, then they will sit in with me and the students. So we'll all sit in together in a meeting and kind of go over the process observer's role, so that the co-leaders are kind of understanding it from a new perspective as well. Sometimes this is the first time they've had anybody observe their group, and they want to know, what are they there to do? And so we kind of do that together. And I think that's been really helpful because everybody feels like a part of that team.
For us, we don't always differentiate between pracs and interns, but sometimes we do. And group is one of those areas where we sort of do a mixture of both. So it starts really early on from the orientation couple of weeks that interns are here. They have a couple hour meeting with me as a group coordinator, talking a little bit about the process of groups, how they work, introduction to groups in the center, and then a discussion of the process observer model, because most of them have never experienced anything like that. And so along with that, they are given some readings. So similar, I provide 1 to 2 or 3 readings based on process observation. One of the articles sort of explains the theory behind process observers. One similarly kind of points out some key ways to think about and how to identify process observation in groups, those sorts of things. The other thing that we do, and then I also similarly will take 1 or 2 of the spots in the sort of clinical seminars for interns throughout the year. The interns also get, and this is regular training for them, we have a weekly group case conference that's a combination sort of case conference / looking at co-leader dynamics, those sorts of things for interns. For prac students, they get less ongoing training. So I get maybe once a semester, we'll do a longer seminar on groups, and then later on process observers. But during the orientation week, one of the things that we do that I think is actually pretty effective is kind of along with the couple hours of orientation, I give a questionnaire to our trainees, but I also ask / volunteer the rest of our senior staff members who co-lead that they have to fill this out too. And there are a couple of things. One is it's a form called the 1-minute co-therapist that asks each co-leader to answer certain questions so they get to know each other. The other is a a questionnaire that is geared towards trainees that asks them specific questions among group. Their anxieties, what would they do if kinds of questions, when do you feel like an imposter, how would you know how to manage those things? And then there's there is a senior staff version that flips those questions on their head, and we expect the senior staff leaders to answer those same questions and share those answers with trainees. So it's a mixture of vulnerability and exposure and kind of opening up those conversations. The other thing that we do in the orientation is that we have a process observer note template that we have our process observers use while they are observing to help guide them through kind of how do you do what you're doing when you're process observing, and it's just 3 or 4 questions. So the trainings are an overview of all of those things, and we front load that to make sure that people have the experiences they need before groups start for the semester.
And Jason, you've sent me the template and the co-therapist, the questions that you use, which I will be sharing with the audience once they send you the link to the recording. Leslie and Jason, both of you mentioned articles and like some reading materials. Would you feel comfortable either sending references or sharing the material so I can also share that with the audience?
Sure. Okay,
that would be really greatly appreciated, I'm sure. Okay, so to the next question. How do you, we'll start with Joeleen, this question for Joeleen and Leslie. How do you introduce process observer to members? And do you have process observers participate in screenings? Leslie already talked about that. And if they do participate in screenings, what's their role?
So our process observers do not participate in the group screenings. During group screenings, all members are notified that there is a possibility there could be a process observer for their group. So they're told essentially the rationale for why we have it, who could potentially be in the group, that of course that they're bound by the same confidentiality limits as we are as therapists. And let them know about kind of the post-processing process, that they'll get to hear feedback and be able to, meet the process observer and hear what they have to say. So all that comes in on the front end. And then if a group does end up having a process observer, when I'm inviting people to join the group, I will let them know who the process observer is and that there's a process observer present. And then the process observer in their first time coming in to do post-processing will do a little bit more of an introduction of who they are and what that's all about.
I guess, yeah, I did share that they participate in the screening if possible. Sometimes that comes down to scheduling and whether or not that will work out. And as far as how they're introduced, we do mention that in the screening, even if they're of course not there. And then part of what I think part of what we do, I really encourage the process observer to introduce themselves and to kind of get so that the clients hear their voice, kind of get the idea this is a real person sitting here, not just a robot observing you, and that makes them a little more human in that process. So that's typically how they're introduced. And then when we see it's time for maybe them to begin maybe having a little bit more speaking parts, if you will, in the meetings, then I usually introduce that if it's within my group that, today we might hear from so-and-so, just, to let you know, so that the group members are prepared for that role may begin to transition. And they're interesting that they're usually rooting for that, that trainee to like, hey, we're excited for you, you get to talk now. So so far it's been very welcomed and it's worked well.
And Leslie, during the group screenings, besides having the process observer introduce themselves, do they ask any questions if they have any?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. Well, usually we'll start out, and sometimes if I'm leading with a newer staff member who's newer to the center or newer to groups, then I'll lead the first screening, and then my co-leader will jump in and we'll share that responsibility maybe in the next screening appointment. And then after the process observer has had a chance to kind of hear us go through the items with a client a couple of times, and we do some, it depends on the group, some will do it one-on-one with a client or just one client, some may have several clients in the screening, but then but then we'll move into them sharing parts. And I just ask them, what part do you feel comfortable sharing? And inevitably there'll be like maybe one they do on their own at some point.
Okay, thank you. So next question for Jason and Joeleen. How do group members react to process observers? What have you noticed? Jason, why don't you start us off?
So for us, it is almost universally positive. I think it starts out maybe with a little confusion in terms of, I don't think members totally get it in the sort of screening phase. But once we get into the group and the group starts, I think they get it pretty quickly. Similarly, I think that because they're all students on some level, they all root for the process observer. They want them to do well. There's not a ton of animosity at all. I think that I think that they think it's a little strange at first. And it's interesting because when we're in person, we follow a similar model where they sit outside the group. And then I have, and this is something that we've toyed with over the years. I've had groups where the process observer has stayed outside the group to deliver their feedback. And I've had other groups where the members invite them in purely for that last 10 minutes, and they will pull their chair into the group to give that feedback, which I think can be really powerful. The thing that has made it interesting though with COVID is when we shifted our groups to Zoom, we also had process observers, and we have our process observers mute themselves and turn off their camera. So I didn't know how participants would respond to that, given that there would be like a black square on the screen. And similar to in person, they seem to have just taken it in stride. It doesn't seem to interfere with anything. They seem to be really receptive. So I haven't had a ton of pushback from group members, aside from a few general questions or confused looks in the beginning until we get started.
I think our experience is pretty similar. So I would say overall a very positive response to process observers. There is often a little bit of apprehension, and specifically in our office where the observers are behind the mirror, there is a little bit of like, oh, who's back there? Like what are they doing back there while they're listening to us? But I think once, especially they meet the process observer, hear what they have to say and get used to them being in the group, they become essentially a part of the leadership team for the group and really start to integrate. If a process observer is absent, members will ask like, oh, where's, this person? We have had some group members, very rare, that have had negative reactions to the process observer, but I don't think it's about the process observer. I think it was because the process observer delivered some challenging feedback that they weren't quite ready to hear. So those are the only times where we've had some potentially negative responses.
Which actually leads me into the next question. What kind of feedback does the process observer provide to groups? So like, is it only, for example, to group as a whole? Do they comment on individual members' work? Do they only focus on a particular type of feedback? Joeleen, if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure, yeah, ours really varies depending on the developmental level of the group. So when people first process observe, I often encourage them to start out with more positive feedback, more group as a whole focus type feedback. And then that's something that evolves as the semester evolves. And we actually do spend some time talking about that in our post-group supervision sessions of like what kind of feedback would be helpful to deliver, because then process observers, as they get more comfortable, as the group develops more, there is openness to give some more challenging feedback and more individually focused feedback. So I think that progression is really important, and having that be a part of the conversation between the leadership team of like what role could the process observer serve in this way? Like what kind of feedback could they potentially deliver that could be helpful for the group as a whole, I think has been helpful.
Jason, what about for you? What type of feedback do your process observers provide?
Sure. So it's similar. I'm okay with individualized feedback as long as it feels appropriate. And In a perfect world, and it does happen this way more often than not, I should say, not just in a perfect world, we spend some time as leader, co-leader, and process observer before that feedback is given, processing it, thinking about what do we know about that client and what might be the best way to provide it, et cetera. But I will say, though, more generally, I encourage my process observers to work on group as a whole feedback, because I find that that is more challenging for the process observer to understand and implement. And so sometimes I will do it backwards. Sometimes I'll have them focus on individual feedback first, and then think about collectively, as we're talking through things in supervision, I might say, okay, we've now identified 3 individuals who we've given feedback in these particular areas. What do we think that might say about the group as a whole if we've got X number of members who are experiencing anxiety when this topic comes up, or experiencing avoidance when this comes up? Might it be that the group as a whole is really all serving to sort of all avoid as a group? Like, this particular topic comes up and the group needs to shut down or change the topic. So I will, it really is individualized, but I'll often go about it sort of in the reverse of say what was said before, where I will have people do the individual feedback first, kind of as a way to understand how to do the group as a whole interventions.
So it sounds like at first, process observers will provide feedback that's more, kind of seems more safe. But then after, so as you do debriefings with them, you talk about what other feedback could be helpful, how can it be delivered, if there's challenging feedback, and what way to present it to the clients. And then as the group continues, then they may find how to provide feedback after that specific session based on what you discussed before. But there's not necessarily preparation after the session between the feedback, right? Like, so they give feedback right after that specific group session.
Okay. The only other thing I would say real quickly is I also keep in mind the growth edge of the process observers. So if there's a particular piece of feedback that not only do I think it would be beneficial for the group to hear, but beneficial for the process observer's own growth, how do you deliver this type of challenging feedback? Then I'll work with them on, you know, this is a growth edge for you too. How do you imagine you'll know when you feel like you can give this level of feedback? Or what are you worried about the reaction might be? Those sorts of things. So it's always this sort of bi-directional. It's equally about the process observer's ability to stretch themselves and give that challenging feedback as well.
Okay. And hold on, I have a follow-up questions to this. Yes, has it occurred that feedback was presented in a way that was not helpful? And how did you all handle that?
For us, luckily, no, that has not happened. And I think part of it is due to the fact that we do a good job on the front end, kind of preparing what kind of feedback is appropriate and doing that coaching throughout to kind of let the process observer know and have a space to talk about it. I could see how that could happen. Fingers crossed it doesn't happen for us going forward. But yeah, we've been lucky. And I think it has a lot to do with our preparation.
For us, I would say we have been, you know, largely lucky too, for the same reasons. However, we have, I don't know that I would go so far as to say unhelpful. I think that there have been times where certainly process observers have said things that have fallen flat, or the group has not picked up in a way that we imagined they might. Conversely, you heard me say earlier that we invite our group members to give, not to give feedback to, but to be involved in the dialogue around whatever the feedback is. We have had a group member say to a practicum level process observer once that they wish they had shown up more in terms of finding their voice. And that was pretty challenging because for that particular trainee, that was part of their growth issue. And so I don't know that I would say it was harmful per se or necessarily unhelpful, but it definitely was challenging in its own way.
And Jason, so for your groups, are they 1 hour and a half long, your interpersonal process groups?
They're an hour and 15.
1 hour and 15 minutes.
Mhm.
And you have process observers come, what, for the last 15 minutes? So you do 1 hour process and then process observer comes in?
More or less, it's about 10 to 15 minutes at the end. It's not a hard and fast rule depending on where the group is, but it's generally at least the last 10 minutes.
Okay. So I'm curious, does it feel like group is cut short in some way because process observer comes in and then?
I wouldn't say cut short. I would say unfinished, as often our process groups are when you get to the end, because they don't wrap up in this nice way. I do think that there are times that I wish we had more time to unpack whatever was delivered, but there's always a standing invitation to bring it up in the next session, which sometimes members take advantage of that, and other times they feel like they've gotten what they need. But I've never really felt like we've opened a can of worms we haven't been able to sort of manage in some way.
So it sounds like there's some reactions that are voiced. Oftentimes it's not finished, but then the group members can bring it into the following group session. Joeleen, I think you mentioned that as well, because you don't have group members react to the feedback. They just ask to bring that in to that.
Right. Yeah. And our process groups are 90 minutes, and we'd go the whole 90 minutes and bring the process observer in at the end. So that's why I think we're super attentive to the time piece, because we know we're actually keeping group members kind of after the group time.
And how many of them actually usually stay, Joeleen, to hear the feedback? Since it's
I have had, like, maybe in my 14 years here at Auburn, like 1 or 2 people leave. Usually people are really interested to hear what the process observer has to say.
And another follow-up for Jason. Jason, you mentioned that depending on the trainees' preparation and where they're at, sometimes you will have process observers switch places with one of the co-leaders. I'm curious how group responds to that when you do have that happen.
So they're made aware in the group screening of the sort of developmental model of our center, and they are told from the outset that as part of that process over the course of the semester, they may come in to find a different person in a co-leader role, and that's part of the training, and it's just part of how group works. Interestingly, and I think this goes back to almost being a cheerleader or really wanting the trainees to succeed, when that time comes that the prac student process, they don't tend to have the same reaction with interns, which I find interesting. But when the sort of less experienced process observer, when they come in to find them in the co-leader role, they will sometimes make some sort of comment or like, yay, you made it, or, oh, we're going to see how this goes, or we're really happy to see you there, or some really supportive, kind of very sweet statement of, you know, kind of acknowledging the switch and really wanting to be supportive.
And a follow-up question to that, this is for Leslie and Jason. So you have process observers transition into these speaking roles. So how do you encourage them to make the transition and take a more active role in the group? And have you faced challenges with doing that? Leslie, why don't you start us off with that?
Sure. Yeah, I was trying to think if there had been any challenges. There's not any that come to mind right away. I guess not in a negative sense, you know, challenges certainly at a healthy growth perspective, maybe. But I will ask getting a sense for where the process observer is in terms of their own development by hearing them speak during our post-processing and kind of getting a chance to hear more about what they're noticing, what they're not noticing, where they're feeling more challenged. They're writing the group as a whole part of the note. And so that's also a way for me to kind of see what they're picking up on, what they're not picking up on. And so when I think that they are really kind of beginning to get a grasp of what they're seeing, how it's different from the individual work they're doing, how and even ideas of an intervention they might have tried had they been one of the co-leaders, those are sort of things that come up. Then then we began to talk about them speaking more or beginning to speak. And so sometimes it really is kind of I guess it's kind of an organic process in that there's not a formula for it exactly, but typically it'll be somewhere around the last couple of meetings of the semester. They will begin to share their reflections in group, maybe make a few comments, or maybe even deliver an intervention. They may start us off, for instance, or be the person to do our wrap up, checking in at the end of group, depending on the type of group. And then when they come back for the spring semester, our plan typically is to have them move into a co-leadership role. So this is kind of like, it's treated as like a warm up for that. And it's not always exactly the same clients that come back, but that's our hope. But there's maybe a different configuration of clients. And what we'll hear when the clients who return come back is like, they're excited that now they get to really interact with this process observer who's in the co-leader role. So that's been interesting to hear that maybe they had ideas of what they would have said to that co-leader, but they were very respectful, or process observer, very respectful of the boundary and didn't talk directly to them. And now they get to ask them questions. So sometimes they are asking questions like, what have you thought about, these things that are happening in group?
Yeah, I would say for our center, as I said, we do a lot of pre-work around having trainees do the 1-minute co-therapist and those sorts of things. So the assumption would be that for a lot of trainees, they've gotten comfortable with their senior staff supervisor or intern supervisor to have those sorts of conversations. So we begin those conversations. Like, let's say, for example, if I know that I'm going to ask my process observer to become co-leader for the next week, we'll have those conversations around, what are your anxieties? What do you think your challenges are? What do you think would get in the way of you showing up? How might we help facilitate that? And, it's not uncommon in the beginning for prac level trainees to be much more quiet, as we all can kind of imagine. If it becomes a little problematic, I may call them in or invite them in through the course of the group by asking them kind of what they think about it, or what is it that they feel like they've heard that client say. And then it's gone as far sometimes as in the supervision afterwards, helping the prac students set goals around, okay, without it feeling too artificial, how do you challenge yourself to speak up at least 2 or 3 times in the next group? And what might that look like? So giving them some anchor points or something to shoot for, so it doesn't feel so ambiguous, or as much as one can plan this sort of thing. I might say, okay, we know this has been a thematic thing. So when this comes up in the next group, I might say this, and then I would want you to kind of come in and say this as a way to invite them in. And then similar to Leslie, I will have them start out the group. So as a way for them to be seen as an equal leader of the group, kind of amongst the members. So there are little tips and tricks and things that we do sort of depending on what's going on.
Thank you. And I will ask the last question for the panel in a moment, but if for the audience, if any of you are leaving early, I shared a feedback link in the chat. Please complete it. It's very short. It helps us out. I do make changes to these panels based on the feedback that you provide. And so the last question I'll ask for the panel for today before we turn over to Q&A from the audience is, how do you balance providing supervision to 2 trainees at once, meaning the co-leader and the process observer? Joeleen, why don't you start us off with that?
Sure. And I will say that for our groups that have process observers, that's 99.9% of the time the configuration that we have a co-leader who's a trainee, either a practicum student or more likely an intern with a senior staff member. So this has been something I've kind of experimented with a little bit. And as I mentioned in my intro, I think we have different approaches amongst different staff members, because I started out, I think, with having the process observer present for a portion of the supervision session, and then some dedicated time for just myself and my co-leader. And yeah, I felt like that worked. But I also felt like the process observer was missing out on some really helpful conversation. So the way I did it this semester was actually asking my co-leaders what they preferred. And both people elected to have the process observer present for the whole time. But one of the things we did talk about, and I know this may be a follow-up question, but You know, like, how do I deliver constructive feedback to you? How do you feel about me doing that with the process observer present? And I think the situations that we were in were kind of unique, where one of the interns had some prior experience with the person who was a process observer, so felt really comfortable doing that. So I think my approach going forward is going to be to really have an active and intentional conversation with my co-leader about what their needs are and go from there.
How about Leslie?
Sure. Yeah. So our configuration may be a little bit different just based on kind of who's at the center. The co-leader, my co-leader may be someone I'm providing clinical supervision to for licensure. So they are a full-time clinical staff member. And so we are already meeting weekly, and I have a very collegial style. And so they're used to that. And but the process observer has not had as much time with me. So they're a part of that process. I treat it more like a peer consultation in that respect. And I'm asking them to give me feedback, to ask questions, use a lot of curiosity. Like if they don't understand something that I did, I want to know. And so it probably, even though the power dynamic, of course, is there, it feels more like a peer supervision or peer consultation time that we're together. And in an example where I may go more into a traditional supervisor role is if it's an ACT group or an area that's a specialty for me, and they are learning that, you know, as they go along, then I may give more feedback around how, you know, maybe an intervention or a comment that was made was not really ACT consistent. And we would talk through like how maybe that, you know, where that came from for them, and then how we might, you know, how we might reframe that. And so and I asked them to do the same for me. So if they say, you know, I was interested because I heard you say XYZ, why did you say that? You know, and I might say, oh yeah, you're right. I was kind of thinking more process at the time, and we were, you know, we were really trying to focus in on this particular intervention we decided to give. So I think there's and there's no one way to do it, and it probably would change based on who my co-leader is at the time. And if it were another graduate student or student in training, counselor in training, it may look and feel different. I just haven't had that configuration.
Thank you. Well, we should turn to audience question and answer portion. So for the audience members, please remember you just unmute yourself and ask your question. For accessibility purposes, you can also type your question in the chat if you're not able to ask it verbally. So please get us started with that.
I have a question. This is Shamika.
Hi, Shamika. Good to see you.
You too. I've been wondering about the difference between groups with a process observer and without. And like, I don't know how to exactly formulate this question. My guess would be that having a process observer to discuss their process observations might actually advance a group more than not having a process observer. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you all have observed with your groups, especially if you have both groups with and without process observers, if that makes sense. And especially for undergraduate groups.
Yeah, I can jump in. I have no data to support this, but anecdotally speaking, I do feel like it helps advance the group a bit. I think it also, a way that we encourage process observers to participate in the group is by sometimes delivering challenging feedback that might be difficult for co-facilitators or that co-facilitators might have missed. So I think that can actually really help forward the group and progress them forward in terms of their development as well. But we've also had process observers where the group gets stuck and things like that. So I like to think it helps anecdotally, but I'm not sure specifically.
I will I think my experience, that's probably true. I think it's more helpful than not. I don't think it's ever hurt, but I think it can sometimes be neutral or more often be helpful. I will say, as the senior staff member in the room, sometimes I feel it's a little bit less of a load to carry if I'm not having to manage a process observer in the room as well. So from the senior staff member perspective, I will say, depending on the either experience level of the process observer or the experience that is developed over the course of the semester by the process observer, it can feel like it takes a little bit of a relief off because I think they're productive and they help the group further and deepen. Where there are other times I feel like it's another layer of something to manage. So it can go either way, but generally speaking, I think it really does potentially deepen the group.
We have anybody still writing dissertations in the audience? This is a great study to do, I think, because I've also been wondering about the same, Shamika. I also have a question from the chat. What is the rationale for sharing process observer feedback at the end of the session versus at the start of the next session?
So this is not a great rationale, but it's the way I've done it before. Like when I think a lot of my ideas about how to do process observation started on internship when I was at internship at Virginia Tech, and that was sort of the way that they did it, and it seemed to work really well. I will say we did one semester, it was actually the summer during the really height of the pandemic, we experimented with something a little bit different. One time we had actually one of our interns who had already had the opportunity to co-facilitate groups do what we affectionately called a super process observer. So we had him actually come in at halfway, give feedback, then go back out. And this was over Zoom. So it was come into the virtual room. And then again, give feedback at the end. So the group members could take and adapt that feedback during the session. And it was actually something the group members really liked. The trainee that was involved really liked it. So it's something we may experiment with in the future.
I would say we tend to give our feedback at the end of the same session. And I suppose if I had rhyme or reason for it, it would be because it's more immediate, that there's this sort of real-time feedback piece of it, rather than waiting until the next session where I think some of the energy or intensity can be lost when that's the energy and intensity that can actually move a person forward. So again, I don't have any data on this, and I know people who do it both ways. I choose to do it at the end to try to capture some of the immediacy of what's going on in the room for that day.
Another question. I see a raised hand. Rebecca, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I have a question. If you have a process group that's sort of running like an ongoing group, do you have a process observer stay the whole academic year if they're going to be at your site, or do you have them switch halfway through at the end of the semester?
I'll jump in. We have them switch to co-leadership. So they'll begin as a process observer for the fall semester, since we all live in academic year semesters, and then begin the spring semester as a co-facilitator. And in that case, either I will, if it's one that I'm working with, I will either drop back into a process observer role if the two co-leaders need some support, and so that I'm kind of still there for the beginning of the semester, or I would drop, or one of the co-leaders would drop out of that group completely. So it depends. We have had a group that the process observer came into this co-leading role, and there were then 3 facilitators, and that was really more the the co-leader or the leader of that group, that was her preference, that they do that way for that group for some consistency. And so I think there's some different models about how that works. The times we don't have them continue on as a co-leader typically has to do with some sort of scheduling that we can't work around. So that's usually, if we don't do that, there's a reason for it.
Yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind for me. So it's very rare for us to have somebody process observe for the whole academic year. We have had that happen before. And the main, they didn't stick with the exact same group. And the reason was primarily scheduling based. And even when we have somebody start as a process observer and lead into a co-facilitator type relationship, it may or may not be with the same group, again, just based on scheduling.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is our practicum trainees are with us for fall and spring semesters. We don't have practicum trainees over the summer. So we tend to have them switch, but like both other panelists, it really depends on scheduling because our prac students are not with us 5 days a week like our interns are. The one thing that we do that I don't know if the other panelists do is that assuming that our interns are progressing the way that we hope they would be, that in the summers we have our interns co-lead groups together and the senior staff members step out. So as group coordinator, I become the one who sort of supervises all of the groups through the group case conference and signing off on the notes, but that there is not a senior staff member necessarily in the room for the intern co-leaders over the group experience. But our interns are required to videotape all of their individual sessions. And we've toyed with videotaping the group sessions. That's a little harder for sort of sound purposes and things. But we do, for the summer term, we allow our interns to co-lead group without a senior staff member present in the room, assuming they're developmentally where they need to be.
There was a question in the chat about guide for process observers, and Jason and Leslie, you've already talked about it during the earlier part of the panel. Joeleen, I don't know if you had anything to add. I wanted to give you opportunity.
Yeah, our process is similar. I think a lot of it happens during orientation, so kind of help people understand the role and providing readings or other things as needed. So nothing different from what Jason and Leslie have said.
Next question, please.
I have a question about process observe on not educating purpose for trainees, but possibly providing feedback to the co-leaders. Would it be helpful to do that, possibly as a group coordinator or someone who is seasoned group facilitator, participate one session possibly and observe the process and provide the feedback to the beginning, co-leader or interns. Do you see the benefit of that? And actually, I'm curious, whether or not we are doing that kind of, practice in university counseling centers.
I could see how that could potentially be beneficial. I think for me, I'd be super attentive to making clear the purpose and what that looks like and why we're doing it, because I think one of the things that's tricky, especially in my role as the associate director, is a lot of the co-leaders directly report to me. So I think there'd be a concern of like what that might look like performance-wise. And I actually was thinking a little bit about this as we were talking, that there is a part of me that would love to process observe some other groups that I'm not as comfortable with, but I am afraid that staff members may feel like that's an evaluative kind of thing for them. So I think the guidelines and purpose would need to be really clear up front.
Yeah, my response would be somewhat similar. As the clinical director, I'm a little I'm in a little bit of a bind in terms of being able to do that in a way that didn't feel evaluative or something. So I'd be real mindful of that. I will say in the supervision piece after the group, in some ways, the way I believe I understood Leslie to be talking about it earlier, it is more of a consultative approach sometimes where I will ask for, issues around dynamics or other things amongst sort of co-leaders, myself included, and kind of invite conversation around that. So in that way, we do that.
I might have missed the original question. I had to step away.
The question was, would you as a group coordinator or somebody with more group experience be a process observer for other staff, like leading groups, to provide feedback?
Okay. Yes, and so no, for some of the reasons that have already been said. And then I have worked with, I'll say I wasn't really a process observer, but I was taking the back seat, maybe, is really how it was framed. So just for context, I was clinical and had some administrative supervision for our sexual assault or victim advocates, and so like domestic violence group or our sexual assault healing group. The clinician really had everything they needed to do the group and all the knowledge, but it was, having another person in the room to help kind of facilitate what might come up in group. And so I really took on more of an observer role and participated as a support. And so that was at the clinician's request, and partly my urging them to take on the lead because I felt that they were ready, but I was there to support them. And then as group went on, I probably, became less and less active and looked more like a process observer. And those groups are very small and very intimate, and we're very open with the clinician or with the clients too about kind of our purpose and why I was there, and that seemed to be well received. So that was really kind of my experience with that. I will say my very first group I led at the center, I wanted to start an ACT group. I think it was the first time maybe they'd had one in some time, and so the group coordinator at the time sat in with me. And I took it more as that she was there to be like my assistant and help out, help handouts, and had a lot of like activities and experiential things we were doing. So I was, I thought it was kind of fun to have her there and get her feedback. But, looking back, that part of that might have also been, for her, some curiosity about like, what will this group be like and how will she handle it? And so the feedback I got was positive, but I could see where that, if things had gone awry, she would have been there to maybe step in.
Yeah, I would say just really quickly on top of that, there have been times I could foresee a scenario wherein we get a new staff member, and I'm thinking about this now because we have 4 new staff members coming in over the next like 2 or 3 months, that there could definitely be a scenario in which maybe I co-lead a group with a new staff member, or a more seasoned group leader might co-lead a group with a staff member. But really do it as a co-lead. And even though in some ways it is evaluative, it really is more in the business of trying to get a sense of where they are in their skill set rather than something that would be punitive. And we haven't always done that, but given that about 1/3 of our staff has turned over, we've been having that conversation more recently about, is this something we want to do to get a better understanding of how we all run groups and we all do clinical work so that we can better gel as a staff. So that is something that is now being discussed amongst our staff.
I see a hand from Adam.
Yes, thank you. So at my counseling center, we have our process observers construct a process note and read it at the beginning of the next session, and that's kind of their intervention. And so it's been really interesting for me to hear about the other models. And I was wondering if someone could provide like a clinical example of like what a process observer might say, like feedback that they might provide at the end of a session, and then how the group might interact with that, just so I could get a better picture of how that works.
I can give a couple of examples, and I don't know how specific these will be. They're a little bit more general because I think it's feedback that comes up pretty often for our groups. But a more group as a whole type feedback that they might provide would be, we have a lot of groups that tend to focus a lot more on thinking and cognitions versus emotion, and sort of what function that's serving in the group, how the group is perpetuating that. The example I gave earlier about providing challenging feedback that didn't go over as well, that occurred when we had a group member who would monopolize the time in the group. And the process observer actually shared with the group members some feedback about how much time was being taken up by each of the group members. And that was something that I think was really interesting for them to hear, and they had differing reactions to that. And for us, like I said, we don't have the group members interact with the process observers, so they just take it in and bring it up the next time. But with the second example, we did have some reactions in the next session to talk about.
By the way, Joeleen, when the process observer talks about specific group member, do they say you and talk to them, or they just like talk to other co-leaders referring to the group member as by their name?
In ours, they do talk directly to them, even though they're not able to respond. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else can provide an example?
One example that comes to mind, a client who had voiced their goal was to work on balancing taking care of themselves and taking care of others. And we had already discussed that they were more inclined to take care of others. And so the process observer was able to make the comment, you know, so-and-so seems to be very nurturing and really looking out for others, asked lots of really perceptive questions of others in the group. And I'm wondering, or I'm curious, I'm wondering if this is in some way they're looking for answers to be able to take care of themselves, or are they going back into that role of caring for others and neglecting what they need? And so it was, you know, in those ways, it's presented as a curiosity that the person has, as opposed to, you know, they're doing this in group and not doing this in group. And so that's one of the ways I've suggested that they, you know, phrase the, what I'm noticing is this, and I'm curious if this is what's happening or what the function of this might be. So that's, I guess, an example from a really more recent group, and that was very helpful thing for that person to hear. And in fact, the whole group responded to that in the next session of kind of joking, we got to figure out, make sure a way so-and-so can get what they need in this group. And so we began to open that up more.
Adam, I'm glad you brought up another model of process observation, of sharing written process observer feedback. We do not have members on our panel with who implement this model, but this model does exist. There's articles on that. I've myself tried that out this semester for the first time, just based on what I read. It was definitely time consuming to edit the notes. That's kind of what my takeaway from that was. And we shared process observer notes, which was like the general process observer comments, like for a group as a whole, and then for individual person, we shared them via email the day before the next group session. And then group members were free to kind of bring up things that come up for them. Our process observer was pretty good with writing. She was fairly efficient. But I imagine if she wasn't, that would also be a lot of work on that process observer, and who trained our trainees already, tight on time. So that was kind of my experience, but there may be others as well. It was my first shot at doing this, and no way an expert, but I just want to acknowledge that that model does exist. Another question.
In these models, I was a process observer when I was a postdoc, and my feedback never got back to the students. Like, I was very much like a silent observer. And I'm curious, did the do the process observers are the ones who write the note? Or is that essentially like, what's the responsibility for that when it's not, the note is being sent to them? Just curious.
It sounds like, is that a question for me?
Everybody, just essentially what's the various responsibilities given that they're more active in the group? Like, who writes the note essentially is my question.
We have the process observers generally write the note as a way to help them conceptualize what's going on and get a better sense of what they're taking away from the group, those sorts of things. We have played around with, and some staff members do this differently, where they do a more maybe equitable or equal model where it rotates around. I will do that, but I tend to rely on, because the prac student is the process observer first, having them write the notes, really because I find that that helps their development in terms of being able to locate and recognize group as a whole interventions, how to understand what's going on in the group, et cetera. It also provides a way for the intern to begin to provide supervision to the prac student around their writing and those sorts of things. So it goes from the prac student writes the note, it goes to the intern is sort of the gatekeeper to give some feedback. And then the understanding is that by the time it gets to me or the senior staff member, it is in theory in its final form. So it's a way for us to gauge both the prac student development and the intern development.
Our process observers typically are writing the group as a whole note, and then the two co-leaders are dividing up individual notes to add. But I will say that's how we start. And then we begin to change that up so that they have experience writing different parts of the note. And we begin writing the note together essentially when we are in our post-processing, and we'll have, which is a handout I'll share, but y'all recognizing process usually, well, now that we're virtual, up on the screen, and we'll look through like what factors, therapeutic factors were present today. And so some of the note is being written as we talk in the post processing, which I think is helpful for all of us and kind of getting all of our notes done. But also then they're adding in more feedback. So I always switch up whether they send the note to me to review for first or my co-leader, just so that there are different perspectives.
And in our model, the process observers are not involved in the note writing at all, which after hearing y'all, I'm rethinking that. That sounds like it would be a really good thing.
Now we have time for one more question, and please remember to fill out the feedback survey. I promise it's really short and helps us a lot.
And if there's not a question, I'll just throw in that the process observer is never a neutral party. I mean, there's some impact that they have on the group, and it can be really fascinating, that impact. I mean, thinking even from the diversity of the group, and how, the process observer may be someone that a group member really can identify with, and it creates a safer space, or that they're reacting to. And so I think that's always interesting and important, I think, to keep in mind, is that they're not a neutral party. I mean, they are there, they're having impact just like everything else and everybody else in the room.
I will ask also a last question to Jason. When you switch spots and you become process observer and your trainees lead the group, how do they respond to you, given that supervisors watching? Have there been issues with that?
Do you mean how do the trainees respond or the members respond?
Trainees, yeah, who co-lead the group when you process observe.
Generally speaking, I think they're pretty excited because it's one of the last things we do. I have an established relationship with them. They expect that it's likely going to happen. They like to see me in the process observer role. They like to gauge whether or not they would have done something similar or different. They also view, or at least the feedback, right? Or kind of my understanding is that it's also a further demonstration that in some ways we're all equal-ish, right? That we all kind of go through those same pieces. And I say equal-ish because obviously there are power dynamics, but also that I'm not above these things either, that there is benefit for even a seasoned group leader to sometimes be process observer as well. Because I do think there is the freedom of being able to sit and observe without having to engage in the co-leader dialogue. That sometimes I'll see things that I might not have seen as the co-leader, right? It does, for me, it's a little frustrating sometimes because I would want to say something and I bite my tongue and kind of sit back. But I think that trainees tend to really actually like it.
Thank you. Well, on that note, we will end our program today. So thank you so much for coming. Again, the recording will be available 1 to 4 weeks. I try to get it sooner, but sometimes I don't have control over that. So as long as we get that uploaded, it'll be coming in. Thank you all so much. And I'll also distribute any handouts, any materials from the panelists to you with the recording link. And so I have all of your emails because you signed up for this program. So it will be coming in the email. Please all take care. And panelists, please stay with me for a few minutes to debrief as audience departs.